The night before the invasion carried a strange, restless energy, the kind that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. Engines hummed across the airfield at Upottery, and men of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment checked their gear in silence or traded quiet words they wouldn't remember later. Among them was Richard Winters, standing with the men of Easy Company, waiting to board the aircraft that would carry them into history. When the planes finally lifted into the dark, they became part of a vast, unseen armada crossing toward Normandy. Winters rode in Plane 67. Ahead of him, Plane 66 carried Easy Company's commanding officer Thomas Meehan, along with First Sergeant William Evans and the rest of the headquarters section. Once over France, flak tore through the sky. Plane 66 took a direct hit and vanished in a burst of fire, leaving no survivors. Winters would not know it yet, but leadership of Easy Company had just fallen to him. The jump itself was chaos. The sky over Saint-Mère-Église burned with tracer fire, and the carefully planned drop dissolved into confusion. Men were scattered across fields and hedgerows far from their intended landing zones. Winters hit the ground alone, gathering himself in the darkness, listening to the distant crack of gunfire and the closer sounds of men trying to find their way. One by one, figures emerged from the night. Among the first was Carwood Lipton, steady and reliable even in the uncertainty. Others followed in fragments, paratroopers from different sticks, different companies, drawn together not by orders but by instinct. At some point in those early hours, a lone trooper joined them, a man who would later become central to the story, though even his identity would blur with time, John Derek Halls. But in truth, the night did not introduce him as cleanly as later retellings might suggest. There was no neat meeting, no clear exchange of names. Winters himself would later recall encountering a sergeant from another company, though he never identified him. What mattered in that moment was not who anyone had been before the jump, but who was standing there now. Armed and ready, the small group moved carefully through the dark countryside, skirting German positions. At one point they came across wagons loaded with equipment, saddles, supplies, pieces of an army still trying to organize itself against the invasion. The Americans struck quickly and moved on, never lingering long enough for the enemy to respond in force. As the hours passed, their numbers grew. Scattered paratroopers drifted in from every direction until Winters found himself at the head of a force of around 50 men. It was no longer a collection of lost soldiers, it was becoming something purposeful. Dawn was approaching, and with it, the need to act. Somewhere in those early morning hours, Halls found his place among them. He had landed alone, disoriented like so many others, until he encountered Frederick Heiliger, an officer connected to the mortar platoon. Heiliger gathered him in, giving him direction in a night that had offered very little of it. Whether they joined Winters before sunrise or reached his growing force shortly after is uncertain. But by morning, Halls was part of the group that would move toward a set of German guns threatening the beaches. The objective lay near Brecourt Manor. From there, German artillery had been firing onto the causeways leading inland from Utah Beach, putting the entire invasion at risk. Winters studied the ground, quickly forming a plan. There was no time for hesitation, no room for perfect coordination. What he had was what he would use. The attack that followed would become one of the most studied small unit actions of the war. Men moved through trenches, assaulting one gun after another, using speed, aggression, and coordination to overcome a larger defensive force. It was during this fight that Halls stepped forward in a decisive way. Accounts differ on the exact sequence of events, but one detail stands firm. At some point in the assault, Halls led a charge toward one of the remaining guns. It was the kind of action that defined the battle. Not grand strategy, but individual decisions made in seconds, under fire. As he advanced, the German defenses responded. Machine gun fire cut across the position. Halls did not survive the charge. Later, Winters would remember that he had been killed by that fire, not by an explosion as sometimes portrayed. The distinction mattered, not because it changed the outcome, but because it spoke to the reality of what happened in those trenches. Close, brutal, and unforgiving. By the time the guns at Brecourt Manor were silenced, the immediate threat to the invasion routes had been removed. The cost, however, was written in the names of men like Halls, whose stories were not always told clearly in the years that followed. Confusion lingered around him, even in memory. Another soldier, John D. Hall, had died when his plane was destroyed before reaching the drop zone, and the similarity of their names blurred records and recollections. Details shifted over time: where he was from, which company he belonged to, even how he first appeared that morning. Yet through the inconsistencies, the core truth remained. John Derek Halls had landed in Normandy as a private first class, part of an 81mm mortar platoon. He had trained in places like Fort Benning and Fort Bragg, and later in England, preparing for a mission he knew would be dangerous. Before the war, he had lived a quieter life in Colorado, working at Mesa Verde National Park. Those details might seem distant from the battlefield, but they were part of the man who made that final charge. For his actions on that day, June 6, 1944, he was awarded the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. His story ended in the fields of Normandy, but his name is carried among those buried at the American cemetery overlooking the beaches, where rows of white crosses stretch toward the horizon. And somewhere in the telling of that long, chaotic morning, between the scattered drops and the rising sun, his path crossed with Winters and the men who would carry the story forward. Not perfectly recorded, not always accurately remembered, but undeniably real, shaped by the kind of courage that rarely announces itself and often leaves only fragments behind.